Summer 1947. A rancher in New Mexico finds strange debris scattered across his land. It does not look normal. It does not behave normally. And within hours, the US military gets involved. Then something even stranger happens. The Army publicly announces that it has recovered a flying disc. Less than 24 hours later, it takes the statement back. For decades, that moment would become one of the most controversial mysteries in modern history. But now, nearly 79 years later, the story is back in a way that feels bigger than ever. Because this is no longer just about Roswell. It is about what governments know, what they hide, and what happens if that truth finally reaches the public. This is the story of how one incident in the desert may have opened the door to the longest-running secrecy battle of the modern age. The New Mexico sun was brutal that summer. Not far from Roswell, a rancher named Mac Brazel walked across his property after a storm and noticed something unusual spread across the ground. At first glance, it looked like wreckage. But the material was unlike anything he had seen before. There were thin metallic sheets that seemed too light for their size. There were small beam-like pieces marked with strange symbols. And according to later descriptions, some of the material would bend but not stay bent, almost like it could return to its original shape. Brazel collected some of it and brought it to local authorities. From there, everything moved fast. The sheriff contacted Roswell Army Airfield, and that meant the debris was no longer just a local curiosity. This was the home of the 509th Bomb Group, one of the most important military units in the world at the time. If something unknown had come down near Roswell, this was exactly the kind of base that would respond immediately. Major Jesse Marcel, an intelligence officer, went out to inspect the site. And according to later accounts, what he found did not feel like ordinary crash debris. The wreckage was spread over a wide area. He loaded pieces into his vehicle and brought them back through military channels. Then came the moment that changed everything. On July 8, 1947, the Roswell Army Airfield issued a press release saying it had come into possession of a flying disc. That statement hit newspapers and radio stations fast. For one brief moment, the US military appeared to confirm that something extraordinary had been recovered. And then, almost immediately, the story was reversed. At a press conference in Fort Worth, officials displayed debris and said the whole thing had been a misunderstanding. Not a flying saucer, not advanced technology, just a weather balloon and a radar reflector. That became the official explanation. To the public, the story seemed to end there. But for many people connected to the case, it never really ended at all. Because the problem was simple. Some of the witnesses insisted the material they saw did not match the explanation they were later given. And that gap between the public story and private belief would become the foundation of everything that followed. At first, Roswell looked like a one-week headline, but over time, it became something much bigger. Not because the government proved aliens existed, not because the world got a dramatic confession, but because Roswell introduced a pattern people would keep seeing again and again. A strange event happens, military personnel respond. Something unusual is reported. Then the story changes. Then silence follows. And that pattern would echo for decades. Before we go further, if you enjoy deep dive mystery documentaries like this one, take a second to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. It really helps the channel grow, and it lets me keep making long-form stories like this. After Roswell, official investigations did continue, at least on paper. The U.S. Air Force launched efforts like Project Sign, Project Grudge, and later Project Blue Book. Thousands of cases were reviewed over the years. Many were explained, some were not. But by the time Blue Book ended, The public conclusion was clear. There was no evidence of extraterrestrial vehicles, no threat to national security, and no reason for further serious study. Officially, the matter was closed. Unofficially, the stigma was just getting started. From that point on, anyone who took UFO reports seriously risked being treated like a crank. Scientists avoided the subject. Pilots hesitated to report strange encounters. Military personnel learned quickly that talking too much could damage a career. That stigma may have been more effective than classification itself, because when people are afraid of ridicule, they silence themselves. And silence leaves very little paper trail. That is what made the issue so hard to challenge for so long. You did not need every witness threatened. You did not need every file destroyed. You just needed enough people to believe that speaking up was not worth the cost. And for decades, that system worked. But the story did not disappear. It kept resurfacing in different forms. Pilots reported objects moving in ways they could not explain. Radar operators tracked things that did not behave like normal aircraft. Stories kept coming in from military and civilian sources alike. Most of them went nowhere until technology started changing the game. By the early 2000s, military systems had become far more advanced. Radar improved, infrared targeting systems improved, cameras became more common. And suddenly, strange sightings were no longer just personal testimony. Some of them had data behind them. That is what made later cases so different from Roswell. Roswell was about debris, memories, and conflicting accounts. The modern era would bring something else: trained observers, multiple sensors, recorded footage, and a government that could no longer dismiss everything as imagination. And once that happened, the old wall of silence began. If Roswell was the spark, then what came after was the system built to contain the fire. Because once the military changed its story, the real question was no longer just what crashed in the desert. The real question became this: how do you keep a mystery that big under control? At first, the answer looked simple. The government did what governments often do in moments of uncertainty. It investigated, classified, and narrowed public access. Projects came and went. Names changed. Committees formed. Reports were written. Project Sign, Project Grudge, and eventually Project Blue Book. On paper, these were official efforts to examine UFO reports, to sort fact from fiction, to calm public fear, to decide whether anything in American skies represented a real threat. And for a while, that sounded reasonable. Thousands of sightings were logged. Witnesses were interviewed. Pilots, civilians, radar operators, police officers, people from every walk of life came forward with stories they could not explain. Some cases had obvious answers: misidentified aircraft, weather balloons, astronomical objects, optical illusions, natural phenomena seen under strange conditions, but not all of them fit so neatly. That was the problem, because even after years of investigation, a residue remained. Cases that resisted explanation. Cases with trained observers. Cases with multiple witnesses. Cases that seemed to involve objects moving in ways conventional aircraft simply could not. And yet, in 1969, Project Blue Book closed. The official conclusion was clean, confident, and final. There was no evidence of extraterrestrial vehicles, no indication that UFOs posed a direct threat to national security, no reason, according to the public position, for serious ongoing study. That statement did more than end a program. It set the tone for the next half-century, because after that, the issue did not disappear. It went underground. Publicly, the topic became unserious. Quietly, the witnesses kept talking. Privately, the questions kept growing. And this is where the story changes from investigation to something much more powerful: Stigma. If classification hides documents, stigma hides people. It teaches witnesses to stay quiet before anyone even has to threaten them. A pilot sees something impossible, he says nothing. A radar operator tracks an object doing things that should not be physically possible. She keeps it to herself. An intelligence officer hears rumors of compartmented programs and strange recoveries. He learns very quickly that curiosity comes with consequences. That is how the wall of silence became so effective, not because every person was silenced by force, but because enough people understood that speaking openly could damage a career, a reputation, or a future. And over time, the cultural pressure became stronger than the official pressure. Scientists stayed away. Journalists kept their distance. Academics learned the same lesson generation after generation. Study almost anything else. Just do not touch this subject if you want to be taken seriously. That was the genius of it. A classified file invites suspicion. A mocked witness does something even better. They make the public laugh. And once people laugh, they stop asking questions. That is how one of the strangest topics in modern history was pushed out of respectable conversation and into the shadows of tabloids, late-night radio, and fringe speculation. Hollywood helped too, even if unintentionally. Alien invasions, little green men, abductions, bug-eyed monsters, endless science fiction imagery, entertaining, yes, but it buried the serious question under layers of spectacle. The result was perfect for anyone who wanted the issue dismissed, because when real witnesses came forward, they were instantly associated with fantasy. Truth became contaminated by nonsense. And sometimes, according to many researchers and insiders, that nonsense may not have been accidental, because confusion is useful. If a real case emerges, flood it with bad information. Mix facts with hoaxes. Let fake documents circulate. Let unreliable witnesses dominate the conversation. Let contradictions multiply until no one knows what is real anymore. That way, even genuine evidence becomes harder to trust. And if the public cannot separate truth from noise, then the truth becomes easier to bury in plain sight. For decades, that strategy worked. But no control system lasts forever, because technology changes everything. In the 1950s, a strange sighting might leave behind only a memory. In the modern world, it might leave behind radar data, infrared imagery, satellite tracking, cockpit recordings, and multiple trained observers describing the same event from different angles. That shift matters, because once enough sensor data enters the picture, the old dismissal starts to fail. And that failure begins to show most clearly in the early 2000s. One of the most important cases happened in 2004 off the coast near San Diego. It would later become known as the Nimitz encounter. At the time, the public knew nothing, but inside the military, trained Navy personnel were seeing something they could not explain. Radar systems tracked objects dropping from extreme altitude to near sea level in seconds. Pilots were sent to intercept. Visual contact was made. Infrared systems recorded footage, and what those pilots described did not sound like conventional technology. One of the objects appeared smooth, white, wingless, with no visible propulsion, no exhaust, no rotors, no control surfaces, no ordinary explanation, and yet it moved intelligently, not drifting, not tumbling, not behaving like debris. It responded, it maneuvered, and then it accelerated away so quickly that experienced military aviators could not keep up with it. That case stayed buried for years, then more followed. In 2014 and 2015, pilots tied to the Roosevelt carrier group reported repeated encounters with unknown objects in restricted training airspace. Not once, not twice, repeatedly. So often, in fact, that these sightings stopped feeling like rare anomalies and started feeling like a persistent operational problem. Something was there. Something was entering military airspace. Something had no transponder, no clear origin, and no obvious conventional explanation. Still, the old system held. Reports were filed quietly. Questions disappeared into secure channels, and public silence remained intact. Until video changed the equation. Footage connected to these encounters began circulating outside official channels. Grainy, limited, easy to argue over, but impossible to fully erase. And once those videos spread, the government faced a choice: keep denying what military personnel already knew was real, or acknowledge at least part of the truth. In 2019, that crack finally appeared. The Navy confirmed that the leaked videos were authentic military footage, showing what it called unidentified aerial phenomena. That moment mattered more than most people realized. Because for the first time in generations, the official position shifted from total dismissal to limited acknowledgement. It was careful language, controlled language, but it was still an admission. Something unknown had been encountered. Something had been recorded. And something in American airspace was no longer easy to laugh off. That changed the conversation overnight. What had been ridicule became inquiry. What had been career poison became national security concern. And once that happened, Congress started paying closer attention, because the issue was no longer just, are aliens real? The issue became much more urgent. If these objects were foreign technology, then the United States had a serious strategic problem. If they were not foreign technology, then the question became even stranger. Either way, silence was no longer comforting. It was dangerous. That is why the modern phase of this story is not really about belief. It is about pressure. Pressure from witnesses, pressure from pilots, pressure from lawmakers, pressure from data, pressure from a system that can no longer hide everything the way it once did. And once that pressure built high enough, the bureaucracy had to respond. New offices were formed, new mandates appeared, reports were requested, records had to be preserved. The machinery of secrecy was suddenly being forced to examine itself, and that is where part 3 begins. Because once the government admitted that something unexplained was really there, the next question became impossible to avoid. Who knew more than they were saying? And more importantly, who was finally... By the time the government finally admitted that some encounters were real and unexplained, the old question came roaring back with even more force. Not just what are these objects, but something far more dangerous. Who has known more than they were willing to say? Because once official denial began to weaken, the silence around the subject did not look accidental anymore. It started to look organized. It started to look structural. And that is exactly where the next phase of this story begins, not with blurry footage, not with rumors from the desert, not even with pilots alone. It begins with people from inside the system, people with clearances, people with careers in intelligence, people who understood how secrecy actually works. For decades, stories about hidden programs had lived in the shadows. Most of them were easy to dismiss. There was always a reason to look away. Not enough evidence, too much speculation, too much noise. But then the pattern changed. More insiders began speaking through protected channels. Some did not go public at first. They spoke behind closed doors, to inspectors general, to congressional staff, to official investigators. And what they described was not a random set of strange rumors. It was a structure, a compartmented structure. A world of access restrictions inside access restrictions. Programs inside programs. Information separated so aggressively that even people with very high clearances could see only one small piece of the whole. That detail matters. Because extreme compartmentalization does more than keep secrets from foreign adversaries. It keeps secrets from your own government. It keeps one office from knowing what another office is doing. It keeps Congress from understanding what taxpayers may have funded. And it makes accountability almost impossible. If no one can see the whole machine, then no one can easily prove the machine exists. That is the genius of deeply buried secrecy. And according to multiple testimonies described in your source, that is exactly the kind of system some witnesses say has operated for decades around recovered materials, crash retrieval efforts, and attempts to analyze technology of unknown origin. Then came the moment that pushed the subject out of the shadows and into the center of public debate. Whistleblowers, not anonymous voices from message boards, not entertainment personalities, not people trying to sell a wild story, but current and former officials using formal channels to report what they believed had been hidden. One of the most explosive claims described in the source is the idea that special teams may have existed to respond when unknown objects came down. Not normal recovery units, but highly specialized groups trained to secure a site, remove materials, and keep public awareness to an absolute minimum. Other testimony described contractors receiving strange materials for analysis, with engineers spending years studying fragments they could not fully explain. Now, none of that by itself is final public proof, and that distinction is important. The witnesses created a pattern, not a courtroom verdict, a pattern of alleged concealment, a pattern of compartmented access, a pattern of official resistance, a pattern suggesting that secrecy itself may be one of the biggest facts in the entire story. That is why the conversation began shifting. The issue was no longer only whether non-human technology existed. The issue became whether the American public, the press, and even elected officials had been systematically kept away from information they had every right to examine. And once that question entered the room, the story stopped being fringe. It became constitutional, because in a democracy, secrecy is supposed to have limits. National security can justify a lot. It can justify classified weapons programs. It can justify intelligence sources and methods. It can justify temporary silence. But can it justify decades of concealment on a subject this big? Can it justify keeping lawmakers themselves from meaningful oversight? That is the point where secrecy stops looking protective and starts looking political. This is also where lawmakers began speaking more openly. According to the source, members of Congress voiced frustration that classification made real oversight almost impossible in public. Even when Congress technically had authority, the executive branch still controlled access through the classification system. That meant oversight could exist on paper while remaining weak in practice. And that frustration kept growing. Because every time a witness came forward, the same wall appeared. Can't discuss that in public, can't confirm that program, can't acknowledge those records, can't answer that question in an open hearing. The pattern became familiar enough that it started raising a darker possibility. What if secrecy was no longer protecting truth? What if it was protecting the system that controlled truth? That fear helped drive a new wave of pressure in Washington, not just for more reports, not just for better terminology, but for laws, real legal frameworks. The source describes how lawmakers pushed for major legislation, including a sweeping disclosure effort that would have created stronger mechanisms for reviewing and releasing UAP-related records. It was meant to build something more durable than a press conference or a temporary office. It was meant to create process, paper trails, deadlines, accountability, and that legislative fight tells you everything about how serious this had become. Because you do not write major disclosure frameworks for subjects, that nobody inside government takes seriously. You do that when enough powerful people believe there is something real buried underneath the secrecy. Not necessarily aliens, not necessarily a crashed spacecraft, but something significant enough to justify a battle over access itself. That is the key shift in this era. For years, the public argument had been driven by belief. Now it was being driven by process. Who gets access? Who decides what stays hidden? Who can block oversight? Who can claim a record exists but still deny anyone meaningful review? Once those questions become central, disclosure stops being a cultural issue and becomes a power struggle. And power struggles leave marks. New reporting channels were created. Investigators began receiving more testimonies. The source says the number of confidential reports rose sharply once people had a secure official path to speak without immediately violating old security obligations. Individuals who had stayed silent for decades suddenly had somewhere to go. That may be one of the most important changes of all, because silence is strongest when people believe they are alone. The moment they realize there are others, others who saw, others who heard, others who signed the same papers and lived under the same pressure, the silence starts to crack. And once it cracks, it rarely seals again. That is where we are in this part of the story, not at the end, not at full disclosure, not at final proof, but at the breaking point between total denial and managed revelation. A place where the government has admitted just enough to make the old explanations feel inadequate. A place where whistleblowers have said enough to make the public ask harder questions. A place where Congress has seen enough to realize that whatever this subject is, the secrecy around it may be almost as important as the phenomenon itself. And in part 4, the story gets even bigger. Because once lawmakers began pushing for answers, the fight moved beyond testimony and into the machinery of government itself. New laws, the National Archives, agency resistance, and the desperate struggle over which records the public may finally be. Once whistleblowers started speaking, the fight was no longer just about testimony. It became a fight over paper, over records, over access, over who gets to decide what the public is allowed to know. Because in Washington, a secret is never fully secure until it is buried inside procedure. And once Congress realized that testimony alone would not break the wall, it moved to something much harder to ignore: law. That was the next phase of the battle, not just asking questions in hearings, not just demanding classified briefings, but forcing the government to identify, preserve, and eventually release records tied to UAP. That sounds technical, but in reality, it is explosive. Because once a government is legally required to gather records from across its agencies, it risks creating something that secrecy hates most: a trail, a map, a structure visible enough for outsiders to study. That is why the disclosure push became so serious. One of the biggest turning points described in your source is the effort to build a formal UAP records collection and require federal agencies to review what they had, organize it, and send it into an archival system built for future public access. The idea was not dramatic on the surface. No press conference, no smoking gun on live television, just bureaucracy. But bureaucracy is powerful when it starts working in favor of transparency instead of silence. And behind that effort was a bigger principle. For decades, secrecy had survived because records stayed scattered. A file here, a memo there, a compartmented program hidden behind another one. A contractor holding material under one set of rules, an agency holding reports under another, and Congress unable to see the full picture. So lawmakers tried to change the architecture itself. If you cannot force instant disclosure, force preservation. If you cannot win total openness, at least prevent disappearance. If you cannot get the deepest answers now, build a system that makes future answers harder to bury. That is the logic behind this stage of the story. And it matters because buried truths often survive not as headlines, but as records someone failed to destroy. According to the source, lawmakers pushed versions of the UAP Disclosure Act, modeled in part on the logic used for historical records review in other major secrecy cases. The original proposals were bold. They aimed to create independent review mechanisms, stronger presumptions of disclosure, and even powers that could reach into privately held materials connected to the subject. That is where the real resistance began, because once the idea of real review appeared, the defense establishment and its allies had a problem. It is one thing to tolerate public curiosity. It is another thing entirely to allow an independent structure to examine hidden programs, contractor holdings, or decades of compartmented records. So the pushback came hard. Some of the strongest provisions were weakened or removed. Independent review lost ground. Eminent domain-style pressure on privately held material faced fierce resistance. The final framework that survived was more limited, but still significant. That detail is crucial, because even a weakened disclosure framework can change the balance of power. What remained, according to the source, still required federal agencies to identify and organize UAP-related records, transfer copies into a National Archives collection, and separate what could be released now from what would remain restricted for later review. That may sound modest, but after decades of near-total opacity, it was a structural breakthrough. In other words, the secrecy system did not collapse, but it was forced to reveal its outline, and outlines matter. Because once an archive exists, even a restricted archive, the government can no longer pretend there is nothing to look at. That is where the National Archives enters the story, not as a dramatic hero, not as a whistleblower, but as the place where secrecy starts becoming accountable to time. According to the source, the archives prepared a dedicated UAP record structure, digital repository processes, metadata standards, and guidance to federal agencies on how records had to be identified, copied, categorized, and transferred. That meant agencies had to decide, record by record, whether something was publicly releasable, partially restricted, or postponed. Even restricted records were supposed to leave behind a trace. That last part is everything. Because one of the greatest powers of secrecy is the ability to deny existence itself. Not, you can't read this. But this does not exist. A catalog changes that. A record listed is a record acknowledged. And once acknowledged, it becomes harder to erase politically, legally, and historically. That is why the records fight mattered so much more than many people realized. This was not only about disclosure. It was about forcing the state to admit the shape of what it knows. The source describes how the archives process required agencies to create digital copies, prepare metadata, and even maintain both redacted and unredacted versions where necessary. In other words, the system was designed to create an audit trail, not perfect transparency, but traceable transparency, the kind that makes future oversight possible. And once that framework existed, agency behavior itself became revealing. Some agencies, according to the source, were relatively easier to imagine in the process. NASA had limited material and older studies. The FAA had pilot reports, radar-related documentation, and some aviation safety cases. NOAA had sensor-related data that could, at least in some cases, be publicly releasable without destroying core national security protections. But then came the real friction. The Department of Defense, the intelligence agencies, The black box world where records are not just classified, but wrapped in layers of access control so dense that even acknowledging their existence can become a battleground. That is where the source gets especially sharp. It describes the Department of Defense arguing that decades of records across multiple branches required extended review, with classification issues and sources and methods concerns slowing the process. Extensions were sought, partial delays were pushed, but the machinery of disclosure, once set in motion, still demanded initial transfers and explanations. Then the deeper agencies become even more difficult: CIA, NSA, NRO. According to the source, these agencies argued that some records could not even be cleanly acknowledged without crossing into protected program territory. And here we reach the heart of the secrecy trap. If admitting a record exists reveals a classified program, then the record cannot be openly acknowledged. And if it cannot be openly acknowledged, then it becomes far harder to transfer, review, or publicly discuss. It is a perfect self-protecting loop. Secrecy defending itself by treating existence as classified. That is not just frustrating. It is one of the central themes of the entire modern UAP story. Because again and again, the public runs into the same wall. We cannot discuss that. We cannot confirm that. We cannot deny that. We cannot address that in an unclassified setting. And every time that phrase appears, the room changes. Because it is no longer a simple denial. It becomes a managed refusal. A refusal that often tells you more than a clean no ever would. The source also explains that Congress tried to anticipate this resistance by building compliance mechanisms into the process. Agencies that postponed or restricted records had to justify that decision. They had to report why disclosure could not occur. They had to notify congressional intelligence committees. And those notifications mattered because they created something lawmakers could track: patterns, which agencies delayed, which claimed special access barriers, which released quickly, which dragged their feet, which appeared to cooperate only under pressure. Once that happens, the burden begins to shift. For years, disclosure advocates had to prove that hidden records should matter. Now agencies had to explain why records could not be shared. That reversal is subtle, but it is powerful, because it changes the political psychology of secrecy. Instead of citizens sounding paranoid for asking questions, agencies start looking defensive for refusing answers. And that is where the public side of the story becomes more interesting, because full release still does not happen. The deepest records remain locked away. The most explosive material stays restricted. The alleged crash retrieval and reverse engineering world remains behind the wall, but something still changes. The public begins to see the skeleton of the hidden archive, a restricted record list, a public finding aid. Titles, dates, origins, categories, reasons for delay, not the secret itself, but proof that the secret has mass. That is enough to create pressure all by itself, because once researchers know a record exists, they can target it. Once journalists know a file exists, they can ask why it is still hidden. Once Congress sees patterns of restriction, hearings become sharper. Once the public sees that some agencies released thousands of pages while others released almost nothing, suspicion naturally grows. And suspicion, in this context, is not irrational. It is often the first political stage before forced accountability. The source makes that dynamic clear. By the time the archives process begins taking shape, the result is not total sunlight, but a two-tiered system. Public records available now, restricted records acknowledged but unavailable, and a growing paper structure that can be challenged over time. That is a dramatic change from the older world, where records could disappear into permanent obscurity with almost no visible trace. And that is why this part of the story is so important. Because many people expect disclosure to look like a confession, a president at a podium, an opened vault, a shocking announcement, but real disclosure often looks uglier, slower, and more bureaucratic than that. It looks like deadlines, metadata, finding aids, compliance notices, restricted lists, oversight letters, interagency resistance, and lawmakers trying to turn silence into documentation that may not feel cinematic. But it is how hidden systems actually begin to break, not with a single revelation, with a growing inability to keep every corner dark at the same time. And that brings us to the deeper tension beneath all of it. Because even with new laws, even with archives, even with hearings and whistleblowers, the central issue remains unresolved. What happens when transparency collides with the national security state's deepest instinct, control? That is where Part 5 goes next. Because once records started moving and the archive began taking shape, the debate shifted again, not just whether records exist, but what they appear to suggest, why some agencies seem more nervous than others, and whether the government is preparing the public for a controlled version of the truth rather than the whole thing. By this point, the fight is no longer about whether the subject is real enough to deserve attention. That part is over. The government has already admitted that unexplained encounters exist. Lawmakers have already forced a disclosure framework into motion. Whistleblowers have already pushed the issue into the center of public debate. Now the real battle is about something else. What kind of truth is the public actually going to get? Because disclosure and full transparency are not the same thing. A government can release information and still control the narrative. It can acknowledge records while protecting the most sensitive layers. It can admit that something strange exists while refusing to say what it might mean. And that is where this story becomes most unsettling. Because the deeper the disclosure process moves, the more it starts to resemble a managed release rather than a total opening. A version of truth, not necessarily the whole truth. And the reason is simple. The national security state has one instinct above all others: control. Control of information, control of timing, control of interpretation, control of what becomes public, and just as importantly, what remains trapped behind the language of protection, classification, and process. That tension is now visible everywhere. On one side, Congress keeps pushing: more hearings, more mandates, more deadlines, more legal pressure, more attempts to make secrecy expensive. On the other side, agencies keep responding with the same core argument: we cannot move too fast. We cannot risk exposure of sources and methods. We cannot tear open decades of classified systems without consequences. And to be fair, some of those concerns are real. A reckless release could expose sensor capabilities. It could reveal intelligence methods. It could compromise military collection systems. It could expose how the government tracks things in the sky, under the sea, or through space. Those are serious concerns, but they are also the perfect shield. Because once national security becomes the language of resistance, almost anything can be delayed, narrowed, or hidden indefinitely. That is why so many lawmakers started treating the UAP issue as more than a mystery. They started treating it as a test case, a test of whether overclassification has become so severe that even elected oversight can no longer function properly. The source makes that point clearly. The hearings tied to broader declassification efforts were not only about UAP, they were also about a larger disease inside government: classification creep. Documents marked secret that contain little or nothing genuinely dangerous. Programs buried not to protect the country, but to avoid embarrassment, oversight, or scrutiny. In that framework, UAP becomes more than a strange subject. It becomes a pressure point exposing how the secrecy system now protects itself. And that matters because once secrecy becomes self-protective, it stops serving only security. It starts serving bureaucracy. It starts serving institutional reputation. It starts serving contractors, agencies, and power centers that may all have different reasons for keeping outsiders away. That is one of the darkest ideas in this whole story. Not necessarily that the government knows everything, but that pieces of the government may know different things, and the walls between them have become so thick that no one wants to risk what happens if those walls come down. Which brings us to the phrase buried deep inside the legislative fight, controlled disclosure. That phrase is easy to miss, but it may be one of the most important in the entire modern era. Because controlled disclosure is not the same as spontaneous truth. It means sequencing, filtering, timing, gradual release, managing public response, releasing enough to maintain legitimacy, but not so much that control is lost. And once you understand that, a disturbing possibility emerges. What if the government is not trying to keep the subject buried forever? What if it is trying to decide the safest way to reveal only part of it? Not because it wants openness, but because total denial is no longer sustainable. That possibility fits the moment almost too well. The public gets more records, lawmakers get more briefings, agencies admit more than they used to, archives begin filling with documents, whistleblowers create constant pressure, and yet the deepest alleged material stays protected. Crash retrieval, reverse engineering, exotic materials analysis, witness testimony under the tightest security controls. Those layers remain behind the barrier, acknowledged in structure if not in content. The source describes this exact tension. Public access expands dramatically, but the most sensitive categories remain classified, with their existence reflected more through restricted listings and oversight struggle than open release. That is not accidental. It is the architecture of managed revelation. Give the public enough to show movement. Give researchers enough to find patterns. Give Congress enough to justify continued pressure. But hold the core until you decide what can be survived politically, institutionally, and strategically. If that sounds cynical, consider what the source says about the legislative battle itself. The strongest tools were exactly the ones that were cut. The independent review board, the eminent domain power over privately held UAP-related materials, and the more forceful controlled disclosure framework. What survived was meaningful, but weaker, strong enough to create archives and records trails, not strong enough to break every sealed compartment. And when the most powerful parts of a transparency plan are removed, you have to ask why. Who was afraid of independent review? Who did not want outside eyes on hidden holdings? Who fought hardest against the idea that government or contractors could be forced to surrender material? Those are not small questions. Because resistance tells its own story. Sometimes what people protect says more than what they admit. That is also why agencies now appear so uneven. Some comply relatively easily. Some transfer records. Some publish material. Some cooperate within limits. Others move like every page is radioactive. The disparity matters, because if one agency has little to hide, its behavior looks different from an agency sitting on something more sensitive, more embarrassing, or more operationally dangerous. The source points out that some agencies transferred large volumes while others transferred very little, and that this gap itself became politically suspicious. Either the holdings truly differ dramatically, or full compliance is not happening evenly. That puts Congress in a difficult position. Oversight is expanding, but not fully penetrating. The source describes this especially through the tension around AARO. It exists because Congress created and funded it, yet it still sits inside the executive structure and answers through the Department of Defense and the intelligence hierarchy. That means lawmakers can demand information, but the executive branch can still restrict what is actually shared, even in classified settings. Some layers remain beyond reach because special access rules and need-to-know structures still hold. This is the heart of the conflict. Who really controls truth inside a classified state? Congress has oversight authority. The executive branch controls classification, and when those collide, history usually favors the executive. That imbalance explains why the process feels so slow. It explains why disclosure keeps advancing and stalling at the same time. It explains why each breakthrough is followed by a reminder that the deepest doors are still locked. And yet something has undeniably changed. The pressure is now systematic. It is not one hearing, not one whistleblower, not one leaked video. It is law, archives, hearings, reporting mechanisms, public websites, censor strategies, classified briefings, committee fights, and repeated attempts to make concealment more expensive than disclosure. The source frames the role of witnesses and lawmakers in exactly those terms, not necessarily to convince every skeptic overnight, but to shift the machinery of government until hiding becomes harder than revealing. That is why this stage of the story feels so strange. The wall is still standing, but it no longer feels solid. It feels patched, cracked, pressurized from behind. And once a secrecy system reaches that state, it becomes vulnerable to something it fears almost as much as exposure itself. Momentum, because every restricted record list creates more questions. Every delay notice creates more suspicion. Every hearing creates more public memory. Every partial release gives journalists and researchers new material to connect. Every new witness makes older witnesses seem less isolated. Over time, that accumulation can become irreversible, not because one explosive confession appears, but because the cost of maintaining the old silence keeps rising. That may be the most important truth in Part 5. We are not watching a clean disclosure. We are watching a power struggle over disclosure. A struggle between institutions trying to preserve control and forces trying to make secrecy traceable, challengeable, and eventually breakable. And that leaves us at the most dangerous question yet. Because once records, whistleblowers, laws, and oversight all point in the same direction, the public naturally begins to ask, if so much energy has gone into controlling this subject, what is it that they are really trying to control? That is where Part 6 goes next, because the next phase is bigger than archives or hearings alone. It moves into the final unresolved territory, what the phenomenon might actually be, why no single explanation seems to satisfy every piece of evidence, and whether the truth, whatever it is, may be stranger and more destabilizing than either skeptics or believers. At this point, the most uncomfortable part of the story is no longer secrecy. It is uncertainty. Because once you accept that at least some cases are real, well-documented, and still unexplained, the next question becomes unavoidable. What are we actually looking at? And this is where the story becomes more difficult than either side wants to admit. Skeptics want a clean answer. Misidentification, sensor error, balloons, drones, optical illusions. Believers want a clean answer too, non-human intelligence, recovered craft, a hidden truth finally pushing into daylight. But the deeper you go, the less this subject behaves like a clean answer. It behaves like a puzzle with pieces that do not all belong to the same box, because some cases do get solved. That matters. A large number of reports turn out to be ordinary things seen under unusual conditions. Balloons, birds, drones, satellites, aircraft, atmospheric effects, sensor artifacts, all of these appear in the record again and again. That is not a weakness in the story. It is part of the story. It proves that serious investigation does separate noise from signal, but then something remains, not a few blurry lights with no data, not just stories from unreliable witnesses, cases with multiple sensors, cases with trained observers, cases with behavior that even officials using careful language still describe as anomalous. According to the source, there are cases that remained unexplained not because the data was too weak, but because the available data described something extraordinary. Objects showing performance beyond known aerospace capabilities, behaviors that did not fit conventional explanation, multiple sensors tracking the same thing at the same time. That changes the debate completely. Because now the issue is not whether people make mistakes. Of course they do. The issue is whether all of this can be reduced to mistakes, and the source suggests that answer is getting harder to defend. Some of the most challenging reports involve objects that seem to hover without visible propulsion, accelerate without normal transition, appear and disappear in ways that make no sense for standard aircraft, or move between air and water in ways that would place impossible stress on materials and systems we understand today. That is why no single explanation satisfies every piece of evidence. Take the simplest possibility first, misidentification. Yes, some sightings are surely misidentified. The source even points to examples where ordinary objects, including satellite trains, produced reports that looked remarkable until timing and known flight data clarified what witnesses had seen. That is important because it shows how easy it is for even sincere observers to get things wrong. But misidentification has limits. It can explain one witness. It can explain a confusing image. It can explain a strange light at a distance. It becomes much harder to use when radar, infrared, optical systems, and trained personnel all converge on the same event. At that point, the mistake would not be one person being fooled. It would have to be a chain of independent systems and observers all being fooled in the same direction at the same time. That is possible. But it is no longer the easy explanation. Then there is the next possibility, sensor error. Again, this cannot be dismissed. Sensors can fail, calibration can drift, software can misclassify, data can be misread. And in a subject this controversial, some percentage of the extraordinary cases may eventually shrink under better analysis. But the source makes clear that the scientific problem cuts both ways. If the sensors are wrong across multiple systems in the same extraordinary cases, that is itself a serious discovery. It would mean a major and recurring measurement problem inside some of the most advanced tracking systems in the world. And that would still be a big story. So even the nothing unusual is happening position has become difficult to hold comfortably, because either the observations are broadly accurate, or the instruments we trust for national defense are failing in extremely disturbing ways. Neither answer is reassuring. Then comes the explanation that has gained force inside national security thinking, foreign advanced technology. This is one of the most serious possibilities because, in some ways, it is the least philosophically shocking and the most strategically terrifying. If another nation has developed systems that can outmaneuver American aircraft, evade detection methods, operate in restricted airspace, and potentially move in ways that current engineering cannot match, then the strategic implications are enormous. The source describes this fear directly. If these objects belong to a peer competitor, the consequences for military planning are catastrophic. That is why officials keep returning to the language of threat, domain awareness, and airspace security. Because even if the answer is not non-human, it could still be revolutionary. But this explanation has its own problems. If these are foreign systems, why are they so far ahead? How were they developed without the usual trail of testing, industrial signatures, intelligence indicators, and strategic leaks? Why do some reports seem to describe behavior so extreme that even breakthrough terrestrial engineering still feels like an inadequate explanation? Again, not impossible, just difficult. Then there is the most unsettling category of all, something non-human. This is the explanation everyone wants to rush toward or run away from, and the source is careful not to claim public proof of that conclusion. In fact, it repeatedly stresses the opposite, that there is no publicly verified evidence reaching the standard required to say definitively that extraterrestrial or non-human technology has been proven. The language is cautious, technical, and incomplete by design, but not publicly verified does not make the possibility disappear. It leaves it on the table, and that may be the most honest place to leave it for now. Because if the objects are not prosaic, not simple error, not conventional classified systems, and not foreign technology, then the remaining space becomes very strange very quickly. Not automatically little green men. Not automatically visitors from another star. Just this, an intelligence, capability, or phenomenon that does not fit comfortably inside the current human map of reality. That could mean many things. It could mean advanced non-human technology. It could mean a phenomenon we do not yet understand scientifically. It could mean several different categories mixed together under one label. It could mean some cases are adversary systems, some are misidentifications, and some are genuinely outside current explanation. That last possibility may be the most realistic of all, because the subject may not be one thing. It may be a bundle of different problems forced into one word, UAP. That would explain a lot. It would explain why the debate is so chaotic, why some cases collapse under scrutiny while others grow stranger, why skeptics can be right about many reports and still wrong about the whole picture, why believers can point to genuinely hard cases without proving every extraordinary claim attached to them. The source strongly suggests this split reality. Most detections resolve into normal categories, but some do not, and those remaining cases are precisely the ones creating the pressure because they survive contact with data instead of dissolving under it. That is also why the scientific side of the story is changing. The argument is no longer simply, do UAP exist? That threshold is already breaking down. The argument is now, what kind of phenomenon can produce these observations? Physicists, engineers, intelligence analysts, and military officials are all circling that question from different directions. Some focus on propulsion. Some focus on sensor validity. Some on national security. Some on pattern analysis. But the source makes the current state brutally clear. The debate has moved from existence to explanation, and explanation remains unsettled. And there is another reason this part is so destabilizing. If the truth turns out to be something non-human, the shock is obvious. But if the truth turns out to be something else, something like a long-running intelligence failure, a hidden technological gap, or a decades-deep compartmentalized system that even senior officials never fully controlled, that is destabilizing too. In other words, almost every serious answer is disruptive. That is why the public still does not have a final conclusion, not necessarily because someone knows everything and is laughing behind a vault door, but because the possibilities themselves are heavy. Each one carries consequences, scientific consequences, military consequences, religious consequences, political consequences, psychological consequences. The source even leans into this broader human question. Maybe the hardest part of disclosure is not what the objects are, but what people will do with the knowledge once the old certainty breaks. That may be the real reason this story feels different now. For decades, the mystery lived mostly in rumors. Now it lives in a harder place, between data and interpretation, and that is more dangerous. Because rumors can be laughed away, but unresolved data inside official systems keeps producing pressure. Pressure on agencies, pressure on science, pressure on lawmakers, pressure on the public imagination. And eventually, one of two things happens. Either the mystery shrinks as better evidence resolves it, or the mystery grows because better evidence keeps refusing to behave normally. Right now, according to the picture in your source, we are living in that middle zone. Enough evidence to make dismissal feel weak, not enough public proof to make certainty honest, enough anomalies to destabilize the old story, not enough open access to settle the new one. That is why Part 6 cannot end with a neat answer. A neat answer would be fake. The most honest ending is the hardest one. Something real is being encountered. A great deal of noise surrounds it. Some of that noise is ordinary error. Some of it may be confusion, secrecy, or disinformation. But after all of that is stripped away, there still appears to be a residue that refuses to go away. And that residue is the story, not proof of aliens, not proof of a hoax, not proof of a single master theory, just proof that the modern world may be standing in front of a door it still does not know how to open. And that is where the next part becomes the climax. Because once the public reaches that point, once the old ridicule no longer works and the new certainty still has not arrived, the only question left is the one that changes everything. What happens if the truth comes out before the system is ready to control it? That is where Part 7 goes next. Catastrophic leak versus controlled disclosure, public panic versus public adaptation, and what a real disclosure event could actually look. At this stage, the final question is no longer whether the wall can crack. It is what happens when it does. Because once a secrecy system reaches this level of pressure, there are really only two ways the truth comes out. The first is the version governments prefer, controlled disclosure, slow, managed, sequenced, carefully framed. The second is the version governments fear most, catastrophic leak, sudden, unfiltered, emotionally explosive. Impossible to steer once it begins. And the difference between those two paths could shape the future of public trust for generations, because disclosure is not only about information, it is about timing, authority, credibility, and whether society feels guided through a shock or thrown into one. The reason this matters so much is simple. If the truth is as large as some witnesses and lawmakers fear, then the revelation would not land like an ordinary political scandal. It would not be one more headline in the cycle. It would hit something deeper, people's assumptions about government, about science, about history, about religion, about who really controls reality and who merely manages the appearance of control. That is why some planners, according to your source, see gradual disclosure as the safest possible path. Not because truth should be hidden forever, but because the shock may need to be absorbed in stages. First, acknowledge the phenomenon exists. Then admit the historical record is deeper than previously stated. Then release more of the encounters. Then, much later, discuss implications, not all at once, not in a single speech, not in one night of chaos, step by step. The source describes this as the optimal scenario from a control perspective, extended, incremental disclosure, allowing society time to adapt to each layer before the next one appears. And from a purely strategic point of view, that makes sense. Governments already understand how to manage difficult transitions. They do it with wars, with pandemics, with intelligence failures, with financial crises. Release only what is necessary. Frame uncertainty carefully. Avoid panic language. Reassure institutions. Prevent a vacuum where rumor moves faster than official information. That would almost certainly be the preferred model here too. But there is a problem. Secrets this large do not stay still forever. Whistleblowers emerge. Documents leak. Investigative reporters connect dots. Digital evidence spreads faster than it can be buried. And once enough pieces escape at once, narrative control begins to fail. That is where the nightmare scenario begins. Not a president calmly revealing the truth, not a carefully built disclosure timeline, but a catastrophic leak. A dump of files, a cache of internal images, a contractor archive, a dead man's switch from insiders who no longer trust official channels, something so large and so specific that denial collapses in hours. And if that happened, the first 24 hours would not look like a science fiction movie. They would look like confusion. The leak appears online. At first, most people dismiss it. Another hoax, another rumor, another wave of fake documents. Then journalists begin verifying details. Metadata matches, known names appear. Program titles line up with previously restricted references. Classified markings look authentic. Former officials refuse to comment instead of denying everything. That is when the mood changes. Within hours, the story stops being fringe and becomes impossible to ignore. Newsrooms go live. Government spokespersons issue carefully worded statements. Social media explodes. Every old clip, every old hearing, every old denial comes back at once. The public does what the public always does in a vacuum. It fills the silence with fear, certainty, and speculation. Some people laugh, some panic, some become obsessed, some insist it is a psyop, some insist it proves aliens, some assume war, some assume religion has collapsed, some assume technology about to be released will change civilization overnight. And in that first wave, almost none of those reactions would be well calibrated, because shock does not produce clarity, it produces velocity. That is why sudden disclosure is so dangerous from an institutional perspective, not necessarily because the truth itself destroys society, but because uncontrolled interpretation can. Then comes the next phase, the first week. Governments around the world would be forced into position almost immediately. The United States could no longer pretend the issue was marginal. Allied governments would demand briefings. Adversaries would search for weakness. Markets would react not just to the content of the disclosure, but to uncertainty about what comes next. If the leak suggested advanced technology, defense sectors would go into overdrive. If it suggested hidden materials programs, energy and aerospace speculation would surge. If it suggested non-human intelligence, the response would become much wider than finance or defense, because then every major institution would be pulled in. Science, religion, education, media, the military, diplomacy. The source points directly toward this larger instability. The revelation would not remain confined to one agency or one issue. It would force a recontextualization of politics, legitimacy, economics, and humanity's place in the cosmos. And then comes the most dangerous question of all. Who speaks for humanity? That sounds dramatic, but it becomes practical very quickly if the subject moves from hidden anomaly to confirmed external intelligence. No one nation can easily claim authority over that. No one military can represent the species. No intelligence service can own the future of contact. That is why the source argues that a real disclosure event would push international institutions into a role they have never fully held before. The issue would become species level, not national. The United Nations or some expanded international framework would suddenly matter in ways that today still feel theoretical, but even that would not happen cleanly. Some governments would cooperate, some would hide what they know, some would try to leverage the crisis for domestic control. Authoritarian systems might be especially vulnerable because their legitimacy depends heavily on information management. If disclosure destroys that control, the political shock may be nearly as destabilizing as the content of the revelation itself. And that leads to a deeper truth many people miss. The real panic scenario may not be people learn aliens exist. Human beings can adapt to astonishing things. The deeper panic scenario is this: people learn that the most important secret in modern history may have been hidden through systems their elected governments never fully controlled. That possibility attacks trust at the root. If unelected compartments, buried programs, contractors, and classification structures controlled the subject for decades, then disclosure becomes more than a cosmic event. It becomes a democratic crisis. And yet, there is another side to this. The source is careful not to treat disclosure as automatic civilizational collapse. That is important. Human beings have lived through nuclear terror, world wars, pandemics, and technological revolutions. We do not absorb shocks gracefully, but we do absorb them. Even something this large would not erase hunger, inequality, or conflict overnight. It would not instantly make humanity wise, but it would change context forever. That may be the most realistic conclusion. Society would not end, it would reframe itself. Schools would change what they teach, philosophy would shift, religion would respond, science would open entirely new frontiers, politics would struggle to rebuild legitimacy, economics would begin pricing a future no one had modeled correctly. In other words, disclosure would not be the end of history, it would be the end of one version of history and the beginning of another. That is why the system fears losing control of timing, because if disclosure happens gradually, institutions can pretend they are leading. If it happens chaotically, institutions are exposed as reacting. And once people see that reaction instead of leadership, they begin asking harder questions than any government wants to face. How long did you know? Who decided to hide it? Who profited? Who was punished for telling the truth? What was kept from science? What was kept from the public? And what else, even now, is still being withheld? That is where the story reaches its final edge. Not proof, not closure, not a neat answer. But the point where the modern world begins to understand that the biggest issue may never have been the objects alone. It may have been the struggle over who gets to mediate reality for everyone else. And that is what makes this story bigger than Roswell, bigger than hearings, bigger than leaks, bigger than even the question of aliens themselves. Because in the end, this may be the story of a civilization approaching a truth it can no longer fully suppress and may not yet. After Roswell, after the denials, after the hearings, after the leaked videos, after the whistleblowers, after the laws, after the archives, after nearly 80 years of secrecy and ridicule and controlled silence, we arrive at the hardest truth of all. This story was never only about objects in the sky. It was about power, about who gets to decide what counts as reality, who gets to decide when the public is ready, who gets to decide whether truth belongs to a nation, a bureaucracy, a contractor, a military system, or to humanity itself. Because the deeper this story goes, the clearer something becomes. Even now, after everything that has surfaced, the public still lives in a split world. In one world, the official one, the language remains careful. UAP are real. Some cases are unexplained. More data is needed. No verifiable public proof has been presented that settles the biggest claims. And in the other world, the shadow world, the pressure keeps building. Whistleblowers say hidden programs exist. Lawmakers say they have been blocked. Archives show that records exist even when the public cannot read them. Restricted files leave outlines where total denial used to stand. That is where we are now, not at full disclosure, not at total ignorance, but in the unstable middle. A place where too much has happened to go back to laughing, and too little has been revealed to claim certainty. That middle ground is uncomfortable. It frustrates believers because it stops short of confirmation. It frustrates skeptics because it refuses to disappear. It frustrates governments because each admission creates pressure for another. And it frustrates ordinary people because the question has become too large to ignore and too incomplete to resolve. But maybe that discomfort is the real point, because history does not usually change in one clean moment. It changes when the old story stops working, and the old story is no longer working. The old story said nothing was there, now something is there. The old story said serious people did not care, now Congress cares, pilots care, scientists care, journalists care, the public cares. The old story said ridicule would keep the subject buried forever, but ridicule is failing. The files are being preserved. The records are being catalogued. The hearings keep happening. The reporting mechanisms exist. The stigma is weaker than it has been in generations. That does not mean the final answer is coming tomorrow. It means the silence is no longer stable. And once silence becomes unstable, the future changes. Maybe the truth arrives slowly. Maybe it comes through archives, one record at a time, a date here, a memo there, a restricted file later opened, a witness finally confirmed, a pattern too clear to deny, or maybe it comes the other way. A leak, a break, a mistake, a document no one meant to release, a chain reaction the system cannot stop. Either way, the direction is no longer the same. For nearly 80 years, the weight of this story pushed downward. Now it pushes outward. Into public debate, into law, into science, into culture, into the imagination of millions of people asking the same forbidden question at the same time. What if this is real? And even that question may not be the biggest one anymore. Because maybe the deeper question is this: what kind of civilization have we built if the most important truth imaginable could be hidden inside compartmented systems that even elected leaders struggle to access? That is why this story feels larger than UFOs, larger than aliens, larger than Roswell, larger than one crash, one hearing, one archive, one movie, or one government. It touches the oldest human fear of all. That reality may be bigger than our institutions, bigger than our explanations, bigger than our confidence, and bigger than the stories we tell ourselves in order to feel in control. If the phenomenon turns out to be foreign technology, the world changes. If it turns out to be a vast failure of perception and systems, the world changes. If it turns out to be hidden human technology buried under decades of secrecy, the world changes. And if it turns out to be something genuinely non-human, the world changes most of all. That is why almost every serious possibility is destabilizing. There is no harmless answer left, only answers with consequences. But there is one final thing worth saying. Human beings are stronger than institutions often assume. Governments fear panic. Bureaucracies fear loss of control. Power fears uncontrolled truth. But people adapt. We adapt to wars. We adapt to revolutions. We adapt to discoveries that shatter older maps of reality, not gracefully, not instantly, but we do adapt. So perhaps the final lesson of this story is not that humanity is too fragile for the truth. Perhaps it is that systems built on secrecy are too fragile for a public that has started asking the right questions. And once those questions begin, they do not really stop. They pass from pilots to reporters, from reporters to Congress, from Congress to archives, from archives to researchers, from researchers to the public, and from the public into history. That is how walls fall now, not all at once, but piece by piece, until the structure that once looked permanent begins to look temporary. So maybe June 2026 becomes the turning point. Maybe it does not. Maybe the date changes. Maybe the names change. Maybe the process drags on longer than anyone wants. But one thing feels different now than it did in 1947. Back then, the story could be buried. Today, it can only be delayed. And those are not the same thing, because delay still ends. And when it does, whether through careful disclosure or chaotic revelation, humanity may finally face the thing that has been waiting behind all of this from the very beginning. Not just the mystery in the sky, but the mystery of what we become when we can no longer pretend we are standing alone at the center of everything. That is the edge of the story. That is the edge of the old world. And whatever comes next, whether it is confirmation, contradiction, collapse, or the first honest step into a larger reality, we are closer to it now than we have